You're in a team meeting and it's your turn to give an update. You know exactly what's happening on a project that you've been working on. But when you start speaking, it feels awkward, maybe a bit too formal. For example, perhaps you say something like, "We are continuing with the implementation phase. There were some issues, but things are okay now." And then after the meeting, someone asks, "Wait, are we behind schedule or not?" And you feel frustrated because that's not what you meant. Again, you know exactly what's happening on the project, but in that moment, your words didn't reflect that confidence or know how, and they didn't sound natural to the update. In my recent lesson on how to give a project update in English, we worked on solving that. We talked about how to give a clear, structured project update in English with a simple three-part framework. Now, if you missed that lesson, I'll link to it below the video so you can watch it next. But for today, we're going to build on that foundation because once you have a strong structure in place, the next step is upgrading your language so that you don't just know what to say, but you say it in a way that sounds fluent and natural. And that's where phrasal verbs come in. Now, I know you've been studying English for years and you're already familiar with phrasal verbs. But here's the thing. English speakers use them constantly, especially in meetings. They're simple, professional, and effective. When you use them correctly, they make you sound more confident, more relaxed, and more like yourself in English. So in today's lesson, you're going to learn exactly which phrasal verbs to use when giving a project update in English. Whether you're starting the update, describing the progress of a project, talking about a delay, or wrapping up. These are the phrasal verbs that make the difference between sounding stiff and sculpted and sounding clear, natural, and confident. So to get started, I want to begin with a quick reminder on why phrasal verbs are so important, especially when you're speaking in professional situations. In fact, I get a lot of questions on this because many of my students are fearful that phrasal verbs are too casual to use in the workplace. But the truth is, they're absolutely perfect. These are the phrases English speakers use all the time. Even though they're easy to overlook, they carry a lot of weight. Phrases like catch up, follow through, or hand over might seem simple, but when you use them correctly, they do two things. First, they make your English sound more fluent, less like a translation and more like a natural response. And they help you communicate in a way that feels clear, direct, and professional without sounding too formal or too casual. Because the truth is, phrasal verbs allow us to communicate with precision. As a result, these verbs will help you sound like you in English, confident, capable, and prepared. So let's begin with the phrasal verbs you'll want to use to start your update in a meeting. I want you to imagine this. You're on a team call. Some of your colleagues missed the last meeting, and your manager says, "Before we move on, can someone give a quick update on where things stand?" In that moment, it's easy to say something like, "I'll tell you what happened," or "I'll give you the information." But here's how a fluent English speaker will naturally respond instead. "I'll catch you up on what we discussed," or "let me fill you in on the latest updates." Those small phrases make a big difference. They sound clear, precise, confident, and professional without being too formal or too casual. So let's take a look at 4 specific phrasal verbs you can use when starting your update. The first one is to catch up on. This means to inform someone or to be informed about what they missed. It's quite often used when someone wasn't present for an earlier conversation or meeting. So instead of saying, "I'll tell you what you missed last time," you could try, "Let me catch you up on what we discussed last time." The second one is to fill in, and this means to provide someone with missing details or background. It works really well when you're adding helpful information. So instead of saying, "I'll give you some information on the budget changes," you can try, "I'll fill you in on the recent budget changes." The third phrasal verb for this category is to bring up. This means to introduce a topic for discussion. And you can use this when you want to shift attention to something new or important. For example, instead of saying, I want to talk about the client feedback, you can say, I'd like to bring up the client feedback we received. And our fourth phrasal verb for this group is go over. This means to review or analyze something, often in detail and often as a group. This is perfect when you want to guide people through a report or recent progress. So instead of saying, let's review the data, you could say, let's go over the key findings from the report. All four of these phrasal verbs are commonly used by English speakers in the workplace, and each one gives your English a more natural rhythm and tone. Next up, we're going to look at how to describe progress in your project updates using language that sounds active, professional, and clear. So let's say that you've started to give your update. You've given a quick summary, maybe something like, we're on track with the rollout, and the team has made good progress this week. So now it's time to share a bit more. What exactly is happening? What have you completed so far? This is where you describe your progress, and the next phrasal verbs will help you do that. So let's go through them one by one. The first is to carry on with. This means to continue something you've already started. Instead of saying we are continuing the testing phase, you could say we're carrying on with the testing phase, despite some delays. It sounds just a little bit more natural and more fluent. The second one is to check in on. This means to monitor something or briefly ask about progress. So instead of, I asked the team if they finished the report, you could say, I checked in on the team's progress with the report. This phrase can also show support without sounding like you're micromanaging. The third one is to follow up on. This means to take further action about something that was previously discussed or assigned. So instead of saying, I contacted the supplier again, you could say, I followed up on the supplier issue from last week. This phrasal verb is especially useful when you're showing responsibility and keeping things on track. Number 4, to keep up with. This means to maintain pace with something that's moving quickly or changing. So rather than say, we're trying to handle all the customer requests this month, you could say, we're working hard to keep up with the increased customer demand. This communicates that you're actively managing a challenge, not falling behind. Number 5 in this category is to move forward with. This means to progress into the next stage of a project or process. So instead of we're starting the next phase, you could say we're moving forward with the next phase of the project. It sounds decisive and clear. 2 things that are always a help in a meeting update. Next is to work on. This means to be actively engaged in something. And it's probably one that you already use, but it's worth repeating because it's simple, natural, and versatile. For example, we're working on the Q2 budget forecast, or our team is working on the final edits to the report. Now, here's something I often hear from my students. They'll say, I know what's happening in the project, but when it's my turn to give an update, I start rambling, I over-explain, and then someone interrupts with a question that I already answered in my mind. And it's not because my students don't understand the work that they're doing. It's because they're trying to say everything just right. And in the process, they lose their listener. Phrasal verbs can help with that because when you use phrases like check in on, move forward with, or follow up on, they act like signposts. They help you keep your update focused, organized, and easy to follow. More importantly, they help your listener follow you without needing to interrupt for clarification. That's the kind of communication that builds trust. It shows your team that you're clear, prepared, and confident. So I want you to take a moment. Think of a project that you're working on right now. How would you describe your progress using one of the phrasal verbs we've just reviewed? After you've completed that and when you're ready to move on, let's look at how to talk about something most of us don't enjoy sharing: delays and problems. Having to talk about delays, problems, or unexpected challenges is one of the most uncomfortable parts of giving a project update. And this is where many of my students feel the most pressure. Because, yes, you want to be honest, but you also want to sound calm, capable, and not like you're making any excuses. That's where phrasal verbs can help. They allow you to describe problems in a way that's clear and non-defensive. So let's take a look at a few particularly powerful ones. The first is to run into. This means to unexpectedly encounter a problem or obstacle. So rather than "we had some unexpected problems," you could try "we ran into some unexpected issues with the client feedback process." It sounds more natural and it creates some emotional distance between you and the problem. It's not your fault, it's just that something happened. The second is to hold up. This means to delay or slow down progress. Rather than "we can't move forward because we're waiting on approval," you could say "the final approval is holding up our timeline for next steps." This shifts the focus to the obstacle, not the person giving the update. The third one for this category is to push back. This means to delay or postpone something to a later date. So instead of "we had to change the deadline," you could say "we've pushed back the launch date by 2 weeks to address some final quality checks." It's clear and direct. Plus, it shows that the delay is purposeful, not passive. Next is to look into. This means to investigate or examine something further. Rather than "I'll check the issue and get back to you," you could say "I'm looking into the issue and will share an update by Friday." This shows initiative and responsibility without overpromising. Number 5 is to sort out. This means to fix or resolve a problem in a satisfactory way. So instead of saying "we need to fix a few issues in the contract," you could say "we're working to sort out a few remaining issues in the contract before sharing the final version." Now, here's something I often say to my students on this. If you're afraid to talk about a problem, you might end up sounding vague or overly apologetic. But when you use clear, fluent phrases, like the ones we've just practiced, you show leadership, even if you're not in a leadership role. And that's what helps others trust you. So let's pause here and take a moment. I want you to think back to the last time you had to explain a delay or an unexpected problem. What did you say? And how could you talk about it differently using one of these phrasal verbs? And now, coming up next, we're going to talk about how to wrap up your update in a way that leaves your listener or your team with clarity, direction, and confidence in what you're doing. So now you've given a clear update. You've shared your progress and you've addressed any challenges. And now it's time to close, because how you end your update matters just as much as how you begin. When you wrap up with confidence and clarity, you help your listener understand what to expect next and what action, if any, they need to take. So let's look at some phrasal verbs that will help you do this naturally and professionally. First is to wrap up. This means to bring something to a close or finish it completely. For example, instead of saying "we're finishing the beta testing this week," you could try "we're wrapping up the beta testing this week and preparing to hand over the results." It sounds polished and complete. Next is to hand over. This means to transfer responsibility or give something to someone else. So instead of saying "I'll give the project to Michelle next week," you could say "I'll hand over the remaining tasks to Michelle next week before I go on leave." This emphasizes responsibility and readiness. The third for this category is to follow through on. This means to complete something that you've promised or committed to. Instead of saying "we need to keep our commitment to fix these bugs," you could say "we need to follow through on our promise to fix these bugs before the launch. This signals professionalism and dependability. Next is to get back to. This means to return with more information or an answer later. For example, you could say, I'll give you the final numbers tomorrow, or I'll get back to you with the final numbers tomorrow afternoon. It's a small shift, but it's one that sounds natural and fluent. Next, to sign off on. This means to give formal approval. So instead of saying, Melissa needs to approve the drafts, you could say, Melissa will need to sign off on the drafts before we proceed. This one is especially useful in project management or collaboration. And number 6 in this group is to put together. This means to create or compile something, often using different pieces of information. So you could say, we're creating a presentation for the board, or we're putting together a presentation for next month's board meeting. And then number 7, to set up. This means to arrange or organize something. You could, of course, say we will have weekly check-ins starting next Friday, or even better, we'll set up weekly check-ins with the design team starting Friday. Each of these phrasal verbs helps you to end your update on a strong note with clear expectations and next steps. Now that you have these 22 powerful phrasal verbs for clear, efficient status updates in English, I want you to put everything you've learned into practice. So imagine this. Imagine you're in a meeting and your manager says, can you give us a quick update on where things stand? I want you to take a moment to write down 2 or 3 sentences. Try using at least 3 phrasal verbs from this lesson today. You might use one to describe your progress, one to explain a delay, and another to share your next step. Now, if you're not really sure where to start, here's another example to follow. We're moving forward with the rollout and wrapping up testing this week. We did run into some delays with the approval process, but I've followed up on that and I expect to hear back by Friday. I'll hand over the final documentation once we get the green light. And now it's your turn. If you're watching this here on YouTube, I want you to share your sentences with me in the comments below so I can see how you're using these phrasal verbs. And even better, if you're watching this over on my website, take a moment to write your response in the comments at the bottom of the lesson. This kind of practice is going to help you internalize the language so it's there when you need it. Now, I want to share one more resource that might help you feel even more confident the next time you need to speak up at work. It's my free fluency training called How to Get the Confidence to Say What You Want in English. In that training, I walk you through the same technique I use with my fluency school students, especially those who feel anxious, overthink their words, or struggle to express themselves clearly in high-pressure moments like meetings. If that's something you're working on, this free training is the perfect next step. And you can find a link down below the video and on my website at speakconfidentenglish.com. Now, before you go, I'd love to hear one more thing. If this lesson was helpful to you, please be sure to give this video a thumbs up here on YouTube and subscribe so you never miss one of my Confident English lessons. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.